On June 6, 1944, the world witnessed one of the most daring and decisive military operations in modern history, the invasion of Normandy. Known as D-Day, this landing would mark the beginning of the end for the Nazi war machine, a turning point that signaled the start of Europe's liberation. But the road to that day was long and grueling. It took months of meticulous planning, deception, sacrifice, and above all, a courage that still echoes through the collective memory of humanity. Today, we'll explore the events that led to this crucial moment and relive the story of those soldiers who risked everything to fight for a world free from Nazi tyranny. To understand the importance of D-Day, we need to go back a few years and understand the context in which Europe was living under Nazi occupation. Since 1939, the Third Reich, led by Adolf Hitler, had begun an unstoppable expansion. Poland, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, France. One by one, these countries fell under German control. Hitler sought to establish a 1,000-year empire that would stretch across Europe, a vision achievable only through the total subjugation of entire nations. France had been occupied since 1940. Its capital, Paris, once a symbol of freedom and culture, was now under the Nazi boot. Daily life in the occupied countries was marked by repression, fear, and censorship. Entire families lived with the constant threat of being detained, deported, or executed. The resources of these countries were plundered to feed the German war machine, and any attempt at resistance was brutally suppressed. The Allies knew that to end the Third Reich, it wasn't enough to contain Nazi forces on the Eastern Front, where the Soviet Union was waging its own bloody war against Germany. They needed to open a new front in Western Europe. This is how the idea was born for a major amphibious invasion that would allow the Allies to regain European territory and eventually liberate all occupied countries. This mission was called Operation Overlord and was planned as one of the largest military operations in history. The planning of Operation Overlord was no easy task. It was an operation of unprecedented scale, and the Allies knew that any mistake could lead to disaster. For General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces, and his top collaborators, this was the moment of their careers and of the war itself. They knew that to execute a successful landing, they would need to overcome complex obstacles. From the unpredictable weather of the English Channel to the seemingly impenetrable defenses that the Nazis had built along the French coast. Planning included the use of advanced technology and elaborate deception strategies. Special landing craft and amphibious tanks were developed that could traverse the beaches. But there was also a psychological component to the operation. A massive misinformation campaign called Operation Bodyguard was deployed. The Allies created an entire fake army, complete with inflatable tanks, wooden planes, and fake radio signals, to convince the Nazis that the attack would occur in Calais, a region much farther north. This deception distracted German forces, dividing their resources and forces. Throughout England, troops, ships, and planes were mobilized, while thousands of soldiers received intensive training. Men and women of different nationalities and social classes came together to fight for this mission. American, British, Canadian, French, and other soldiers formed a coalition united by a common goal. The coordination was complex, involving thousands of ships and aircraft and more than 150,000 soldiers. Every move was crucial. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, Allied soldiers began their approach to the beaches of Normandy. The weather had been unfavorable, and the operation was nearly called off. However, Eisenhower made the decision to go ahead, knowing that there would be no other opportunity like this. The invasion was divided into 5 landing zones: Utah and Omaha, which would be stormed by the Americans, Golden Sword, assigned to the British, and Juno, where the Canadians would land. Each of these beaches presented unique challenges, with Omaha being one of the most dangerous due to heavy German fortifications. As the first landing craft hit the shore, the soldiers found themselves in a hellish barrage of fire. German machine guns fired incessantly from strategically placed bunkers, while mines and obstacles on the beach made it nearly impossible to advance. Soldiers jumped from the boats into the water, carrying heavy equipment, and many never made it to shore. Some drowned under the weight of their packs, while others were struck down before reaching land. Those who survived the first minutes on the beaches knew that every second counted. As they advanced, the bodies of fallen comrades reminded them of the high cost of this mission. And despite the fear, there was no turning back. The stories of heroism on D-Day are countless. Some soldiers, like General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., insisted on landing alongside their troops despite his age and health issues. Roosevelt was one of the first to step foot on Utah Beach, encouraging his men to keep moving forward. His leadership and bravery were crucial to the advance on that beach. Another example of bravery was Canadian Sergeant Leo Major, who, despite being injured by a grenade explosion, continued to fight and lead his unit. British soldier Stanley Hollis was also distinguished for his heroic acts on D-Day, earning the Victoria Cross. But heroism was not limited to a few names. Most soldiers advanced under constant fire, risking everything to complete their mission. These men faced indescribable terror, but their desire to free Europe gave them the strength to continue. The success of the invasion in Normandy was the turning point the Allies needed. With D-Day, the Nazis were forced to fight on two fronts, the Eastern Front against the Soviets, and now the Western Front against the Allies. Operation Overlord allowed the Allies to establish a foothold in Europe, from which they moved forward to liberate occupied territories. The advance was swift and efficient. Despite fierce German resistance, Allied forces managed to liberate towns and cities across the Normandy region. The local population, who had suffered under Nazi occupation, welcomed the soldiers as heroes. The liberation of Paris in August 1944 was a symbolic moment. France regained its freedom, and the morale of the Allies was strengthened. For Hitler, D-Day was a devastating blow. He had counted on the Atlantic Wall, a series of fortifications built along the European coast, to hold off any invasion attempt. But the failure in Normandy showed that the Third Reich was not invincible. Less than a year later, in May 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Hitler, who had promised his followers an empire that would last 1,000 years, committed suicide in his bunker in Berlin. The invasion of Normandy was the first step toward the definitive fall of Nazism. D-Day remains a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and the power of unity in the face of tyranny. More than 10,000 Allied soldiers were killed or wounded that day, and their sacrifices were not in vain. Today, cemeteries and monuments in Normandy honor these heroes. Every year, people from all over the world visit Normandy to remember the cost of freedom. The names and stories of these soldiers remain etched in the collective memory. They remind us that peace and justice must be defended with courage. June 6, 1944, changed the history of Europe and the world. It was the beginning of the end for the Third Reich and a testament to the sacrifice of thousands who fought for a better world. Remembering their story is honoring their legacy and cherishing the peace they left us.